My sister filed an anonymous report to ruin me at work, but the truth she hid exploded in front of everyone. I remember the sound before I remember the faces. The lobby doors breathed open, and the usual murmur of our floor went quiet. Keyboards dulled. Conversations clipped themselves mid-word, as if the building had taken a breath and held it. I had just come back with a paper cup of coffee, the cardboard sleeve warming my palms, trying to convince myself it would be an ordinary morning in an ordinary office in downtown Houston. Two officers stepped through the glass entry. Their uniforms were pressed to a razor edge, their steps even and deliberate. Something about the way they scanned the room told me they were not looking for a hallway or a nameplate. They were looking for a person. They were looking for me. The taller one lifted his chin when he saw my badge. The other already wore gloves. I set the cup on the corner of my desk because my hands had gone strangely steady, steadier than my heartbeat. When he said my name, he said it like a statement, not a question. We are here to conduct an inspection. There has been an anonymous report. Anonymous sat there between us like a coiled wire. My coworkers tried to appear busy. A swivel chair creaked and then went still. Someone cleared a throat that did not need clearing. Slack chimed from a few desks over, a bright little sound that did not belong in a room that suddenly felt like a courtroom. I nodded and asked what they needed. The taller officer lifted a clipboard. Access to your workspace. Accuracy, he added, requires our full cooperation. He had said those words before to other people in other rooms. I could hear it in the way his voice did not rise or fall. I could also hear what he left out. This would not be quick, and it would not be kind. It is strange how the ordinary turned sinister in an instant. The pen cup at my elbow looked like a jar of needles. The family photo on my monitor stand looked like a witness. A stack of policy memos felt like a stack of charges. I did not reach for any of it. I kept my hands where they could see them. A lesson I never expected to use in an office dot across the floor, near the glass of the manager's office. My sister stood with her arms folded and her face arranged into concern. Celeste had always worn concern like it was couture, tailored to impress. To anyone else, she looked like support. To me, she looked like a match that had not yet been struck. I felt the old ache behind my ribs, the one that belonged to school, projects and scrubbed counters, and the quiet way a mother can take one child's side without ever saying the words. I did not look at her long. I would not give her the pleasure of catching my eyes first. The officers did not ask if I would object. They asked where to begin. Top drawer, I said, though my voice came out lower than I intended. I heard my own tone and understood it. I was not going to beg them for mercy. I was going to give them the map and let them get lost in the truth. The room had a new geometry now. My desk was the center. Every gaze bent toward it. People who had shared break jokes with me kept their faces tilted to their screens but let their ears turn all the way around. The intern, who always wheeled her chair too fast, parked herself behind a ficus and forgot to pretend it was about the plant. In that new geometry, approval and reputation do not matter. Only noise does. The first time a folder snapped open. 3 heads lifted in the same second. I told myself to breathe. In, hold, out. I told myself to stand still. I told myself not to reach for dignity, because the act of reaching would make it seem like I had lost it. It is a hard thing to do. Nothing when every instinct tells you to grab for something, anything. That proves you are still the person you were 5 minutes ago. The officer with the gloves adjusted his cuffs and studied the little landscape of my workspace. He did not stare at me long. Professionals do not watch the person, they watch the perimeter. His partner marked a line on the clipboard and glanced past me into the open office, as if to remind everyone that this was official. Documented, unmissable. I felt the familiar whisper that has followed me since childhood. Stay calm when they expect you to crack. It is not courage. It is calculation. A crack gives people a story. Calm gives them a mirror. Somewhere behind me, a chair wheel squealed against the carpet and stopped. The ventilation hummed. A courier cart rattled down the hall, then faded. Our manager stepped out of his office, checked his watch without looking at it, then drifted to the far wall. He folded his arms in the exact same way Celeste had, though his face showed a different kind of fear. He feared a mess. She feared a miss. She feared a plan interrupted. I let my eyes find the reflection in the conference room glass, because it was easier than looking at faces. The reflection was clean, almost too clean. A woman standing straight, a desk that looked like a set. 2 officers in the frame, one ready to touch, one ready to record. And behind that, blurred but present, the shape of a sister who had never learned the difference between being first and being right. Anonymous kept ringing in my head. Anonymous is useful when you want to hurt someone without getting your hands. Dirty Anonymous is a mask that still smells like the person who wore it last. It is not hard to guess a perfume you have known your whole life. The taller officer cleared his throat. He asked again for permission to begin, though he did not need it, and I gave it anyway. Permission is not always surrender. Sometimes it is a stage direction. Sometimes it tells your audience where to look. I set my palms on the desk and felt the smooth grain under my skin. The coffee at the edge of the blotter had cooled without me. I slid it aside so it would not spill when they started pulling things open. My hands did not shake. I was grateful for that detail. Small as it was, people remember shaking. They remember sweat. They remember the ways a body tells on itself. I thought of the meeting we had last quarter, when I took a project nobody wanted and turned it into a client renewal. I thought of the email Celeste sent that night, the one that CC'd our mother for no reason at all. Proud of the team, she wrote, as if she had been in the room. I did not answer. I had learned there are some invitations you decline by staying silent. The officer with the gloves shifted his weight. He looked ready to move. The other made one more note on the clipboard, then lifted his eyes to mine and gave a small nod that was not quite polite and not quite cold. It meant, here we go. I straightened. The room leaned in. Every story needs an opening, and this one had chosen mine without asking. I would not give it my fear. I would give it my attention. When the officer reached for the handle of my top drawer, the metal clicked, bright and final. The sound traveled across the floor faster than a whisper. Behind the glass, a silhouette lifted a phone. A few desks away, a notification chimed, quick and eager. I took one breath, slow and even, and made myself ready. Then the first drawer slid open, and the search began. The drawer slid open with a sound sharper than it should have been, a thin metallic scrape that seemed to echo against the walls. The officer in gloves leaned forward and began moving things with a precision that made every item feel incriminating. Pens clattered against one another. A sticky note curled up under his touch. Its inked reminder, call client back. Suddenly, transformed into something suspicious by the way he held it. He opened my planner. Next pages fanned like a deck of cards, appointments and deadlines spilling into the air as though they were secrets. He paused long enough for the others to notice, then snapped it shut with a carelessness that left me colder than if he had thrown it away. I stood still, but inside, every detail cut like glass. The compact I kept for quick touch-ups, my lipstick, a receipt folded neatly in the corner pocket, all of it was lifted, inspected, and dropped back down like contaminated evidence. Nothing illegal, nothing even unusual, yet each item felt dirtied, just by the way it was touched. The officer with the clipboard made notes while his partner moved to the second drawer. Paper clips spilled in a scatter. My spare charger cord dangled in his hand before being tossed aside. Then came the photographer group of us at last year's holiday party, laughing, red-cheeked arms around each other. He studied it for a beat, his expression unreadable, then set it face down on the desk. That small gesture landed harder than any accusation. A picture meant to preserve warmth now turned over like an embarrassment. Around me, the office hummed with silence that was not silence at all. Fingers hovered above keyboards without striking. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in a chair. Their stillness was louder than noise, a collective decision to watch without being seen watching. And then the first betrayal. A faint camera click. I turned my head just enough to catch the reflection in the conference room. Glass, one of the interns' phone angled discreetly, capturing the moment. Within seconds, a Slack chime rolled across the floor. Eyes darted to screens. Smirks tugged at lips. My search had become entertainment. Humiliation flared hot in my chest, but I kept my arms folded and my posture unbroken. I remembered a line I had once written on the inside of a notebook cover. If they want to collapse, give them a wall. So I gave them a wall, even as I burned behind it. The second drawer emptied. The third followed. Papers shuffled. A file folder snapped open and shut. Each sound echoed, magnified by the silence surrounding it. To my colleagues, I was no longer a coworker. I was a suspect, stripped bare in the middle of their workday, and standing by the manager's door, Celeste watched with arms crossed, her expression arranged in perfect imitation of concern. To anyone else, she looked like a sister troubled by my downfall. To me, she looked like an author reading her own script come alive. The officer with the clipboard cleared his throat. His pen hovered over a fresh line. Anonymous report was detailed, he murmured, more to his partner than to me. The word detailed lodged itself like a thorn. Detailed enough to know my drawers, my planner, even the way I stacked files. That wasn't the work of a stranger. I straightened my shoulders. forcing calm into the room. If they wanted shame, they would not get it from me. But as the search dragged on, humiliation sharpened into something else. Not fear, not even anger, recognition. This spectacle was never about evidence. It was about theater. And I already knew who had built the stage. The glove snapped once more as the officer reached for the last folder. The sound jolted me back into the present. I kept my face still, though my pulse beat hard against my throat. The search wasn't finished, but the performance was clear. And as they reached deeper, I realized the real wound was not in the hands rifling my desk. It was in the silence of the people who had once shared laughter with me, now sitting still, complicit in their watching. That silence carried me into the next truth. This humiliation wasn't meant to end at my desk. It was only the beginning. A curtain rising for the person standing across the room with folded arms and a faint smile. And so the search was not just the first humiliation. It was the shadow of Celeste stretching longer, pulling me toward the moment when her mask would show its true shape. She stood where the light caught her, just enough to look angelic, framed by the glass of the manager's office, arms crossed, in a way that said she was merely observing, detached, worried for me. Anyone glancing quickly would see a sister keeping watch, concerned but restrained. I knew better. I had lived my whole life in her shadow. Celeste didn't stand near that door to support me. She stood there to claim the perfect view of a downfall she had scripted. The expression on her face was a mask I had seen since childhood. One she wore so convincingly that even our mother believed it. That same mask had earned her praise at every dinner table we ever shared. The mask of the perfect daughter. The reliable one. The golden child who could do no wrong. While I was cast in the role of the one who tried hard but never quite measured up, memories rose unbidden, each one sharper than the search unfolding at my desk. The science fair project we had been assigned, to work as a pair. I spent nights hunched over cardboard and glue, slicing models with blistered fingers. She rehearsed a 5-minute speech. When the day came, she stood proudly in front of the board I had built, pointing with polished gestures, her voice smooth. The teacher congratulated her on her initiative. I stood in the background, invisible. My mother hugged her that night, as if she had won the Nobel Prize or the endless chores. I would scrub kitchen counters raw, sweat stinging my eyes. Celeste would arrive at the last second, toss a towel casually over her shoulder, and suddenly it became her victory. Look, at Celeste, my mother would say, smiling wide, always helping, always reliable. I'd still have soap on my hands when the words fell, silencing my own effort. The pattern never broke. In family dinners as adults, I'd talk about my clients, projects finished, accounts renewed. My mother would nod vaguely before turning, her praise toward Celeste. Your sister has such leadership. She's always so dependable. Every conversation was a rerun of the same play, and I never had this script. So when the officer muttered that the report was detailed, my heart didn't sink. It hardened because I already knew who had written those details. They weren't anonymous at all. They had the fingerprints of someone who had studied me for years, who had rehearsed for this role her whole life. Celeste wasn't content with being admired. She wanted contrast. Her light demanded my shadow. A vibration rattled my desk. I turned my phone face up. A message from her lit the screen. Don't panic. If you admit to a few small mistakes, I can protect you. I'll make sure this doesn't ruin you. My throat tightened, not with fear, but with fury. There it was, the perfect performance of concern. She had lit the fire and now arrived with water, expecting me to thank her for putting it out. I didn't reply. I didn't let my face shift. Instead, I set the phone down with the screen against the desk, leaving her words suffocating in the dark. Across the room, she raised her brows ever so slightly, waiting for me to cave, waiting for the performance to play out just as she imagined. I gave her nothing. Silence was my answer. She had always mistaken my quiet for weakness. What she never learned was that silence can be sharper than words. And as I stood there, humiliation burning through me, I realized the search of my drawers was not the true spectacle. The true performance was her shadow stretching across the room, painting me as guilty while she posed as the savior. The officers kept working through my things, but I barely saw them now. My eyes locked on Celeste, on the faint curl of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth. She wanted me small. She wanted me erased. And yet every second I stayed upright, every breath I took without breaking, was a defiance she hadn't accounted for. The clipboard scratched again, and the officer cleared his throat, ready to press further. I straightened, forcing myself back into the moment. This search wasn't over. And worse, the silence of my coworkers was turning colder by the minute. Their eyes no longer held curiosity, they held suspicion. And that suspicion would be the next cut. By the time the officers left my desk, the damage was already done. My things had been shuffled and handled until they no longer felt like mine, and the eyes of my coworkers still clung to me even after they looked away. I needed air. I needed a voice that wasn't soaked in suspicion. At lunch, I stepped outside, the Houston heat wrapping around me like a damp cloth. My phone felt heavy in my hand, but I dialed anyway. If there was anyone who could still give me ground to stand on, it had to be my mother. For a moment, I let myself believe she would hear the shake in my voice and remember I was her daughter, not a case file. She answered quickly, her tone brisk, already edged with disapproval. "Your sister called me," she said before I could speak. "She told me you've been careless at work. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" The word careless hit harder than the officer's questions. "Mom, that's not what happened." She twisted it. Celeste orchestrated this entire thing. But my mother sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years of practiced disappointment. "You always think the world is against you. Maybe it's time to admit your sister is only trying to help. She's worried about you." The phone burned hot against my ear. "Help." My voice was steady, though my hand trembled. "She called the police on me, and you're telling me that's help?" Her silence on the other end said more than words. I could almost picture her expression, lips pressed, eyes tired, choosing the golden daughter over the one who refused to bend. It had been the same since we were children, but hearing it now, in the middle of a storm I hadn't created, was worse than any judgment from strangers. "If this is her version of helping," I whispered, forcing calm into each syllable, "I'd hate to see what harm looks like." She exhaled sharply, a sound of impatience, and then the line went dead. I didn't bother calling back. I stood against the wall of the building, eyes closed, the weight of her betrayal pressing harder than the sun overhead. The saddest part was not that my sister had set the fire. It was that my mother had handed her the match. That moment hardened something in me. I realized there was no shield waiting at home, no comfort in the arms of family. They had chosen sides, and I was on the wrong one. When I walked back into the office, the air felt different, colder, sharper. My coworkers avoided my eyes, their whispers clipped short when I drew near. The silence wasn't curiosity anymore, it was judgment, and that judgment was about to become isolation. When I stepped back inside, the shift was immediate. The air in the office had thickened, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the whispers from the morning and were now breathing them back at me. The familiar hum of keyboards no longer sounded like routine, it sounded like cover, a practiced noise to hide the silence that spread whenever I walked past. Maria, who once greeted me each morning with a warm smile, kept her head bent over her spreadsheets. She tapped at her keyboard with exaggerated focus, as though a single glance my way might condemn her by association. Jack, across the aisle, cleared his throat nervously when our eyes met, then spun his chair toward the window as if suddenly fascinated by the skyline he'd seen 1,000 times. The worst was Ethan. For years he had been my closest ally here, one who backed me up on deadlines, who spoke up when others tried to cut me off in meetings. I found him at the coffee machine, the same spot where we had shared complaints and jokes on late nights. "Ethan," I said softly, almost pleading, "you know me. Tell me I'm not alone in this." His shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn around. He set the coffee pot down, poured into his cup, and for a moment I thought he would speak. But he only muttered, "I can't," before walking away without another word. That was the knife that went deepest. Betrayal from my sister I had expected. Indifference from colleagues I could stomach. But Ethan's silence carved something hollow inside me. The one person who knew my work best, the one who had once sworn he trusted me above anyone else here, had chosen the safer path of distance. As I returned to my desk, conversations faltered around me. Two analysts leaned together, whispering too quietly to catch words. Yet both stopped the second I drew close, their faces flushed with guilt. The intern who had taken that photo earlier now avoided my eyes completely, though her screen lit up with notifications that suggested the image was making its rounds. The isolation was no longer subtle. My chair in the conference room had been shifted to the far edge, an empty space left deliberately where I once sat near the center. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message. You don't belong. Humiliation stung, but beneath it, something colder began to grow. Edmund Burke's words echoed in my mind. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I finally understood it in a way theory never teaches. Their silence wasn't just fear, it was complicity. I pressed my palms flat against the desk to stop the trembling. My coworkers thought their avoidance would break me. That suspicion would erode me into dust. But all it did was strip away my illusions. If I was to survive this, I couldn't rely on whispered loyalty or fragile friendships. I would need something harder than sympathy. I would need proof, undeniable and sharp. And as the cold spread through the office, I realized this stage was being prepared for something larger. The search was only an opening act. The real performance was still to come, and Celeste was waiting for her spotlight. The summons came late in the afternoon. Hollister's assistant walked the floor with a clipboard in hand, her voice stiff when she announced, "All staff to the conference room." No explanation, no pretense of casual routine. Just a command that pulled everyone from their desks. When I entered, the arrangement told me everything before a word was spoken. My usual seat near the center, where I had always been part of. The discussion was gone. The space sat empty, glaring, while a single chair waited at the far edge of the table. Exile in plain sight. I slid into that corner without hesitation, but my body knew what it meant. The room was sending a verdict before the trial even began. The lights above hummed faintly, casting everyone in a pale, unforgiving glow. Papers rustled as colleagues tried to busy their hands. Some looked at me, then quickly away. Others didn't bother to hide their curiosity. Every eye was drawn toward the stage that had been set, even if no one admitted it. Celeste arrived last, as if she had rehearsed the timing. She carried herself with practiced calm, her blouse pressed, her expression carefully schooled into worry. She even placed her hand briefly on Hollister's shoulder as she took her seat. The gesture so small yet so deliberate, planting herself as the figure of reassurance. The meeting began with hollow words from Hollister about serious concerns raised and the importance of transparency. But it wasn't his voice the room was waiting for, it was hers. Celeste leaned forward, her tone smooth, measured, rehearsed. "We all know my sister has been under a lot of pressure. Mistakes happen, but the truth is, these issues can't be ignored." I warned that her workload was slipping, that she was overwhelmed. "I've tried to help, but it's reached a point where the company's reputation could be at risk." The words were daggers dipped in honey. She wasn't accusing me. Outright, she was saving me, positioning herself as the reluctant protector. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from shame, but from the precision of her performance. She had turned my silence into her script, and now she was reading it for the whole office. Whispers spread along the table. Someone nodded faintly. Another jotted a note as if the story were already written. That was when I felt the crack of something deep inside me, the limit of endurance. I leaned forward, my voice cutting across her polished rhythm. "Stop speaking for me." The words fell heavy, slicing through the room. Conversation stopped. Even Hollister's pen froze above his notepad. My sister blinked, caught off guard. Her lips parting in a moment of surprise, she quickly tried to mask. "If you have questions," I continued, my voice steady though my heart hammered, "then ask me directly. I won't let someone else narrate my mistakes." The silence that followed was sharper than any accusation. Some colleagues shifted uneasily in their chairs. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet mine. But the air had changed. For the first time since this began, I wasn't absorbing blows. I was returning them. Celeste recovered quickly, offering a faint smile meant to soften the edges. "You're defensive, and that's understandable. But denial doesn't change facts." She let her gaze sweep the table, gathering sympathy like currency. Yet I saw something else in her eyes, on irritation she hadn't expected to feel. I had broken the script. Hollister cleared his throat, fumbling for control. "Let's keep this constructive. We're here to resolve issues, not create divisions." But the division was already there, carved into the room, visible in the way people leaned toward her and away from me. Still, I sat straighter, refusing to fold. My voice had cut through once, and I knew it would again. And as the meeting dragged toward its uneasy close, the door opened, and another figure stepped inside. A man with a leather briefcase, calm and deliberate, his presence altering the rhythm of the room. HR had brought in Corwin, the legal consultant. He didn't smile, he didn't fidget. He simply opened his folder and looked directly at Hollister. "I've reviewed the report," he said evenly, "and some details do not add up." The room stilled, all eyes shifting from my sister to him. For the first time, the ground beneath her performance cracked dot, and in that quiet, I felt the first flicker of relief because I was no longer standing alone. Corwin didn't raise his voice when he entered, but the room shifted as if a weight had been dropped in the center of the table. He placed his leather briefcase on the polished wood with deliberate care. opened it, and pulled out a slim folder. Every movement was unhurried, precise, the kind of pace that forces others to wait. He was not here to play. He was here to dismantle. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at Hollister before speaking. "I've reviewed the documents we received yesterday," he began. His tone was calm, clipped, but each word landed like a gavel. "And some of the details do not align with the company's own records." The whisper of paper filled the silence as he laid out a few pages. He tapped one with the end of his pen. "This contract is dated on a Sunday. Our offices were closed." Another includes a signature that does not match handwriting samples on file, and the timestamps on these supposed emails. They don't correspond with our server logs. Not even close. I watched the color drain slightly from Celeste's face, though she masked it quickly with a practiced expression of concern. To the others, it looked like she was listening intently. To me, it looked like she was calculating, working to patch the holes that had just been torn through her carefully woven net. Hollister leaned forward, squinting at the page as though he were only now realizing the cracks in what he'd accepted. Without question. Around the table, colleagues shifted in their seats. Some cleared their throats nervously. The room, once heavy with suspicion directed at me, began to tilt. Corwin continued, his voice even but unyielding. "I understand the urgency to respond to allegations, but urgency cannot replace accuracy. If accuracy is our goal, then we must tread carefully. Otherwise, we risk mistaking fabrication for fact." The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of judgment pressing against me. It was the silence of doubt, spreading outward, settling over Celeste's carefully built stage. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than isolation. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a foothold. Someone else was finally willing to see what I had seen all along, that the story being told about me didn't fit the truth. Celeste leaned back slightly in her chair, forcing a faint smile. "Mistakes in paperwork happen. Surely we don't want to make a mountain out of clerical errors." Her tone was light, dismissive, but the edges of her words were sharper than she intended. She was rattled, even if only slightly. Corwin didn't flinch. "Clerical errors don't forge signatures. They don't alter system logs, and they don't conveniently appear in only one person's desk drawer." The words landed with finality. A few heads turned toward me, and though no one spoke, the suspicion in their eyes softened, replaced by something else: hesitation, maybe even reconsideration. I sat straighter in my chair, breathing in deeply, letting the steadiness in Corwin's tone anchor me. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Someone else had spoken truth into the silence that had nearly crushed me. But as much as the relief flickered inside me, I knew this wasn't the end. Cracks were forming, yes, but a house of lies doesn't fall all at once. And Celeste had built hers high, with walls thick enough to withstand a first strike. The officers exchanged glances, their pens moving again. Hollister cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before. "We'll need to review these findings further." The meeting adjourned with none of the confidence it began with. Chairs scraped back, papers shuffled, eyes darted between me, Corwin, and Celeste. The once certain narrative now hung in suspension. As I walked out, Corwin's voice caught me just before the door. Low, steady, only for me. "Stay patient," he said. "Truth takes longer to build, but it lasts longer than lies." I nodded, carrying his words with me. Relief was dangerous if it made me careless. This was not victory. This was only the beginning of the unraveling. And by the next morning, I would learn just how far Celeste was willing to go to keep her story intact. The escalation came the very next day. We were called back into the conference room, blinds drawn. Halfway, so the afternoon sun broke into thin, fractured lines across the table. Two officers sat waiting, a fresh folder in front of them. The moment I saw it, I felt my chest tighten. Folders in this building no longer meant routine paperwork. They meant weapons. One officer slid the folder toward Hollister, his gloved hand pressing it flat. "We recovered additional documents during a follow-up inspection," he announced. He opened it with slow precision, as though savoring the reveal. Outspilled contracts stamped with my signature. Emails riddled with glaring errors I would never make, and handwritten notes that bore my name across the top. Each page was a trap disguised as evidence. Gasps broke the room's silence. Colleagues craned forward, their eyes widening. Hollister picked up one sheet, lips tightening as he read aloud. "An email sent under your account, quoting incorrect policy terms to a client. His voice faltered as if even he couldn't reconcile the claim with what he knew of me. Yet still, doubt crept in. My throat tightened, but I forced my words to cut through. That is not my handwriting. That is not my timeline. The shorter officer countered quickly, almost rehearsed. The documents were found in your drawer. I don't care if they were taped to my desk. I shot back, voice steady, sharp. They aren't mine. But the whispers had already begun. Could it be true? Someone murmured. Another leaned toward her neighbor, muttering behind a hand. Years of work, of trust, carefully built, began to crumble in seconds under the weight of falsified pages. Then came the betrayal I hadn't anticipated. HR ushered in Lena, the junior associate I had once mentored. She wrung her hands nervously, eyes darting between me and Celeste before settling on the floor. I saw her skip protocols. She stammered. I thought she was just under pressure, but it happened. Her words trembled, but they were enough to ignite the room. Colleagues leaned closer, soaking it in. Hollister's pen froze mid. Even the officers straightened as if they'd been handed confirmation. I stared at Lena, my voice low, cutting. Look me in the eye and say it again. She couldn't. Her gaze dropped instantly. But the damage was already done. Whispers rippled, fast and eager, planting seeds of doubt that would grow whether she watered them or not. You're being used. Lena, I said, my tone steady, though my chest burned. And one day you'll realize pawns are the first to be sacrificed. Her lip trembled, but she stayed silent, frozen in her fear. I turned to the officers, leaning forward, forcing clarity into the storm. If you want the truth, compare these papers against the system logs. Don't rely on loose sheets anyone could slip into a drawer. The digital record won't lie. Corwin, seated near the corner, nodded firmly. She's right. Any serious investigation begins with verified system data, not stray documents. His words carried weight, a small anchor in the sea of doubt. The officers exchanged glances, their pens pausing over their notes. Hollister hesitated, his face drawn, caught between appearances and reason. Finally, he exhaled. We'll review the logs. The words brought a flicker of relief, but it was faint and fragile. Because I knew this was no longer about evidence, it was about perception. And perception had already turned against me. As the meeting adjourned, tension clung like smoke. Colleagues filed out quickly, whispering to one another, their eyes avoiding mine. Through the glass, I caught sight of Celeste waiting in the hallway, arms folded, her smile small and satisfied. She had planted the evidence, arranged the testimony, and stood ready to watch me fall under the weight of her lies. But as I walked past her, I met her eyes, letting silence be my shield. She thought the forged papers would be my noose. What she didn't realize was that paper burns, and when it does, it leaves nothing but ash, and soon the truth buried in the system would begin to surface. The revelation came not with shouting, but with a calm statement that shifted the ground beneath all of us. We were gathered again in the conference room, blinds drawn tight this time, the air already heavy with suspicion. The officers sat side by side, their laptops open, the glow of the screens reflecting off their glasses. One of them cleared his throat and spoke with deliberate precision. We've traced the original call that initiated the complaint. The sentence hung in the air. My pulse quickened, though my face stayed still. I had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it, but the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Every eye in the room turned to the officers, waiting for the name behind the mask of anonymity. The taller officer continued. The complaint was not anonymous. The call was placed from a personal phone registered to Celeste Alvarez. The room broke into gasps. Papers rustled, chairs shifted, voices whispered in disbelief. I sat frozen, not from shock, but from the cold confirmation of what I had known all along. My sister hadn't just orchestrated suspicion, she had summoned it with her own voice, her own device. Celeste reacted instantly, her mask cracking for the first time. That's impossible, she snapped, her tone sharper than she intended. Anyone could have borrowed my phone. You can't prove it was me. The officer's gaze didn't waver. The timestamp of the call coincides with your logged location. It was your phone, it was your call. The whispers grew louder now, no longer directed at me. Colleagues who had once avoided my eyes now turned toward her, their faces painted with disbelief. Hollister paled, his pen slipping from his hand. Even those who had believed her every word sat stunned. Confronted with the truth written in data, I breathed slowly, keeping my composure. This wasn't triumph. Not yet. But it was the first undeniable fracture in her performance. The evidence had spoken, and for once, it hadn't been twisted in her favor. Celeste pressed forward, desperate to regain control. You don't understand. She's framing me. This whole thing is her manipulation, and you're falling for it. Her words spilled too quickly, lacking the polish she had mastered. The smoothness was gone. What remained was panic trying to dress itself as reason. For a moment, the room seemed to sway. Caught between two realities, the story Celeste had sold them, and the truth the officers had laid bare. The tension was suffocating. I leaned forward, slightly, my voice calm, unyielding. Anonymous, you said, no, it never was. I told you from the start, this has her fingerprints all over it. The silence that followed was louder than her protests. The officers made notes, my colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, and in that stillness, the balance began to tip. But I knew better than to believe she was finished. A woman who had built her power on manipulation would not surrender at the first crack. She would fight harder, claw deeper, lash out. And by the next meeting, she would prove just how far she was willing to go. The meeting that followed was unlike the others. This time, it wasn't tucked away behind drawn blinds or hushed into secrecy. HR called it in the glass-walled conference room, the one that overlooked the entire floor. Everyone knew what that meant. This wasn't just a discussion. It was a spectacle. When I walked in, I felt the weight of eyes on me. Colleagues lingered near the copier. Others pretended to pass by with papers in hand, but their steps slowed as they angled for a clear view. Even those too cautious to gather close found excuses to stay at their desks, their gazes flicking upward again and again toward the transparent walls. The conference room had become a cage made of glass, and we were the animals inside. Celeste was already seated, her posture composed, her expression arranged with care. To an outsider, she looked calm, prepared, even noble. But I caught the stiffness in her hands, the twitch at the corner of her mouth. The cracks were there, hairline fractures in a mask she had worn for too long. The officers began, their voices were steady, official, carrying just enough volume to reach the ears pressed close to the glass outside. We've reviewed the system logs and printer metadata, one said, clicking through files projected on the wall. The documents in question were generated under a single user account. The print job originated on April 10th at 8:42 p.m. The username tied directly to Celeste Alvarez. The room stilled. Outside, the murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Celeste leaned forward quickly, her voice rising. That doesn't prove intent. Anyone could have accessed my account. Anyone could have used my login. The second officer didn't look up from his notes. Security footage shows you at the printer that evening. The timestamps aligned exactly. Her chair screeched against the floor as she shoved it back. This is manipulation, she shouted, her composure cracking. She's framing me. She's always been jealous, always trying to tear me down. Her words rang loud enough for the hall to hear. People outside pressed closer to the glass, their faces painted with shock. For years she had cultivated perfection, tone, graceful posture, flawless poise. And now, before their eyes, she was unraveling. I sat still, hands folded neatly on the table, every muscle inside me taut with restraint. I didn't need to raise my voice. Her collapse was louder than anything I could say. Hollister shifted uncomfortably, his authority thinning with each frantic word she spilled. Celeste, he warned, but she ignored him, her hands slamming against the table. She planted those files. She's the manipulator, not me. You're all blind if you can't see it. The crowd outside didn't look blind anymore. They looked transfixed, their whispers sharp and fast, their disbelief aimed not at me but at her. The predator had been caught pacing in her own glass cage. Corwin finally spoke, his tone quiet but deliberate. No lie survives the daylight. What we see here is daylight. Celeste froze, her chest heaving. The silence that followed was heavier than her shouting had been. Even she could feel it, the weight of gazes, the turn of judgment, the collapse of the story she had built brick by brick. I lifted my chin, letting my eyes rest on her. Not in triumph, but in clarity. She had mistaken silence for weakness, control for victory. But in the glass-walled room, with the truth projected on the wall and the company watching, her empire cracked before everyone's eyes. And yet, as she slumped back into her chair, I knew this wasn't her end. A cornered animal fights hardest when the cage closes. The next confrontation would prove just how dangerous she could become. The summons for the final hearing arrived at dawn in the form of a clipped email from HR, attendance required, evidence review, nothing more. The words were simple, but the weight behind them pressed down on me like a verdict, waiting to be spoken. When I walked into the conference room, the blinds were half drawn again, but this time it wasn't to shield the meeting. It was to filter the light, to make sure no one mistook this for routine business. Around the long oak table sat the company's leadership, the HR director, the investigators, Hollister, and Corwin. Every chair was filled, every pen poised. The air carried the silence of judgment. Celeste arrived late, as if she still believed she could control the rhythm of the room. Her tie was slightly crooked, her hair not as precise as usual. She sat heavily, dropping into her chair rather than gliding into it. The room saw it. Everyone saw it. The lead investigator stood, clicking through a projected file on the wall. His voice was calm, unhurried, but each line struck with the weight of finality. We have compiled the findings from the past 2 weeks of inspection. Each alleged irregularity has been cross-referenced against system data, metadata, and security footage. He tapped a screen. The results are conclusive. Slide after slide revealed the pattern. Documents dated on closed office days. Handwriting mismatched. Printer logs tied directly to Celeste's username. Emails that never existed in the server archives. And finally, the call records the so-called anonymous complaint traced directly to her phone, with her location data matching the time. The room didn't gasp this time. It didn't need to. The evidence was heavy enough to crush the silence on its own. Celeste broke first. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped, her voice rising with desperation. "You're all blind. She's been manipulating you from the start, turning you against me. She's jealous. She's always been jealous." Her hand slammed the table. The sound echoed, raw and frantic, nothing like the carefully curated calm she had mastered for years. For once, she looked less like the golden child and more like what she truly was, a woman cornered by her own lies. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned forward, my tone even, every syllable sharpened with restraint. "You called them for me," I said, my eyes fixed on hers. "But they came for you." The silence that followed was louder than her shouting. Even Hollister, who had once avoided my gaze, lowered his eyes in shame. A few colleagues shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the loyalty they had shown her with the reality now carved into data and evidence. Corwin spoke then.com as ever. "We've confirmed the findings. These reports were falsified. The complaint was fabricated. The responsibility lies with Ms. Alvarez." His words landed with the finality of a gavel. Celeste's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, she had no script left to read. Hollister exhaled sharply, pressing his palms against the table. His voice was clipped, but resolute. Effective immediately. "Celeste, you are suspended. This company cannot and will not tolerate this behavior." The officers closed their files, nodding in agreement. HR scribbled notes. The decision was no longer pending. It was written. I sat back, breathing evenly, the tension rolling off me in waves. Not triumph, not celebration, just the quiet recognition of survival. My silence had outlasted her noise. Chairs scraped and people began to rise. I felt the weight of their glances on me. Some eyes carried regret, others recognition. They had believed the wrong story, and now they knew it. No one applauded. No one congratulated. But the silence that filled the room was no longer aimed at me. It was aimed at her. When I stepped outside into the Houston sun, the light felt different. For months, it had burned like an interrogation lamp. Now, it felt like release. I breathed deeply, my chest finally free of the weight I had carried alone. Celeste thought she had written my ending, but this wasn't her story anymore. It was mine. And I knew, as I walked away from the building, that my path was no longer tied to her shadow. But even as I turned the corner, the thought lingered, may write the first chapter, but I would write the last. And what came after her collapse would be the redefinition of everything I once thought family meant. When it was over, when the last file had been closed and the last accusation silenced, I walked out of that building carrying something heavier than relief. Freedom doesn't come light. It comes layered with exhaustion, with the echo of every door that slammed in your face before someone finally opened one. The sun was fierce above the Houston skyline, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like an interrogation lamp, burning me down to bone. It felt clean, steady, a light that no longer judged. I stopped on the sidewalk, the traffic rushing past. People moving forward with their lives, unaware of the private war that had just ended inside those glass walls. To them, nothing had shifted. But to me, everything had. Family. That word had always been heavy, carrying the weight of expectation. Blood is thicker than water, they'd said. Blood protects, blood binds, blood endures. But what I learned is that blood can also blind. It can bind you to lies. It can force you into cages you never built. My sister had called the storm on me, and my mother had handed her the match. Loyalty wasn't automatic, it was chosen. And they hadn't chosen me. Corwin's words echoed in my mind. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. I had spent years twisting myself into knots, trying to win approval from people who measured me against a scale I could never tip. I thought survival meant earning their recognition. What I see now is that survival came from letting go of it entirely. I don't need their praise. I don't need their validation. My worth isn't something Celeste can forge on a piece of paper, or my mother can dismiss with a sigh. It isn't fragile enough to be broken by silence. It's mine, and it always has been. That realization didn't roar like triumph. It whispered, steady and sure. And in that whisper came strength I didn't know I had. I had walked through suspicion, humiliation, betrayal, and yet I was still standing. Stronger, not because they lifted me, but because they tried to bury me. And I learned how to breathe underground. Redefining family isn't about erasing blood. It's about drawing new lines, choosing who earns the right to stand beside you. Colleagues who had once turned their eyes away now looked at me with respect. Strangers in that office had shown more honor than the sister who shared my last name. That truth stung, but it also freed me. Family is not about who you're tied to at birth. It's about who ties themselves to you when the world sharpens its knives. As I walked toward my car, the city alive around me, I felt the shift deep in my chest. I was no longer fighting to be seen through Celeste's shadow. I was no longer chasing my mother's version of approval. The story that began with humiliation and betrayal had ended with clarity. She thought she had written my ending, but she only wrote the scene where I stood up. And as I stepped into the fading light of that day, I knew the story wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, about the new definition of family I would carry forward. And in that moment, the case was closed, not just against her, but against the chains I had once mistaken for love.